Hello, I'm Patrick. Welcome to my first video in a series on MVC and Visual Studio 19. This series is intended for beginners and it will show you how to make your first MVC project and also how to create a database using a code first method with EFCore. This video will cover the basics of the creation of MVC projects in Visual Studio 19, but I'm not going to go too deep into much things. I'll give it an explanation, but it's really intended for somebody, say front end, that doesn't really have a clue about how to create these things, can navigate their way around a little bit easier in these projects. So, series objectives. We're going to start with getting a basic overview of what MVC is. To create a new MVC project in Visual Studio using the templates provided. To understand the basic components of a template and how they're routed around and how to edit them. To learn to make new views and how to use controller methods to access them. To understand layouts and how to interact with the pages that you create. To create controllers and views using models and auto scaffolding tools within Visual Studio. To understand how the created elements work and how to use migrations to create a new database. And to learn how to view the data and tables created within Visual Studio. This is a very basic overview of what I'm going to be covering. I will be going into a little bit more detail, but I really don't want to dive too deep into each one of the things. The intention is not to make everybody an expert in MVC, but really just to give an overview of what it is and how to use it. It's especially useful for people like front end who come into a project and don't know how to navigate around it. I will be making this video as a code along exercise, and I do suggest that you do code along with what I'm doing. You will get the most out of it that way. I will be using Visual Studio 19, so it's probably best to have that downloaded first of all, as I'm not going to be going into the installation and downloading of Visual Studio. I intend to make each one of these videos quite short, really because I believe that the best way to deal with things is in very small bits so you can easily digest it. Talking about that, I want to show you the next slide, and this is something I believe in quite strongly. How do you eat an elephant? Probably heard this one. In tiny chunks. And basically what I'm talking about there is quite often I see with these videos expert coders who are talking to other coders because what they're saying is too complex for just anyone to get their head around. So I think if you break it down into little bits, do exercises with those little bits, it becomes a lot more manageable. So let's get started. What is MVC? Model, view and controller. A model, it's an object that you define and then that can be used in other parts of the program. A view is something that you display for you people in front end. Imagine it's like a HTML page. And the controller. This is really the cogs of the program. It's the thing that tells the views how to work, and it also handles all the requests that come in from the users and what to display on the pages and such like, and what to do with information that's sent back from the user. What we're going to do now is just get started with our first MVC project. We're just going to open up Visual Studio. So this is just Visual Studio 19. Just go down to create a new project. Create a new project, and we want to be going into a core web application. If you don't see it, then just search for it at the top bar here, you'll find it. And click Next. You can call the project whatever you want, but I'm going to call it my first MVC project. And press Create. Now what you'll see is a whole load of options here. Make sure you're on NetCore, not Net Framework. For this we're going to be using NetCore. I'm actually running 2.2 at the moment. I dare say you can use other versions of it, and especially when 3.0 comes in, you'll probably be able to use that. However, at the moment the most current and stable that's out of beta is a 2.2, so I'm going to be using that. So Web Application, Model View Controller, and press Create. Okay, so it's going to load up your first template. I'll go over some of the components in a minute, but for the moment I'm not going to be teaching you how to use Visual Studio, only the bits that are going to be relevant to what we're doing. So first thing you want to do, just run the project. So now you should be able to see the first template of what your project looks like. You'll notice here that the name that you gave it is on here. All of this stuff is customizable and we will be doing later. This is just to give you an entry point into it. So this up here is a nav bar, and you can click on the various things. At the moment both of these links go to the same place. You'll see a privacy policy, takes you to a privacy policy page. All of this can be changed and will be changed. There's also a footer at the bottom down here, and here is a link that takes you to learning about how to build these sort of projects. So we'll cancel off that for the moment. So the first thing you'll notice on this side here is these three folders, which are Control, Model and View. For the moment we're going to leave the models alone and we're going to concentrate on the views and the controllers. Left click on the arrow there, you'll open up the views. And what we're going to do now is going to go into the folder which is called Home, and I just want you to click on the index, and this is going to load up the CS HTML page for the index. This is the page that you've just seen when you load it up. It does use Bootstrap. Again, I'm not going to go into Bootstrap in this. Most of you probably are familiar with Bootstrap, but if you're not, then don't worry about it too much. It's just a framework for styling, and this is automatically loaded within the MVC framework in Visual Studio. So this is a page that we just saw. This block here is something which is called Razor syntax. I'm not going to go into Razor syntax in this series at all. Maybe in a future series I will do. But now just imagine that this Razor syntax is what is allowing it to communicate in C#. This is a welcome message. So we're just going to change that welcome message to say hello whoever. I know it's traditional to say hello world. That bothers me a bit, being traditional. So we'll do hello whoever. Now we're going to save the page. You can do this up here. You can press Control and save, or when you run the page it'll build it and save it automatically. Then we're going to hit play again. Now you'll notice that we've changed the message here to hello whoever. Good. That's all I wanted to show you with this for the moment. So again, we're going to stop the project. If you notice up here in the tabs that you've got, this is something called the index CS HTML, and it's inside the home folder. So if I just quickly run this again, you'll see here that this automatically goes to this folder. I'll be covering that in the next bit on routing. But if I go home, it will also find it that way. If I go home index, it's also going to find it that way. Now if I just try typing index alone, you'll see that it can't be found. And that's for a simple reason. That within the routing, which I'll show you shortly, the route that it looks for is a controller called home. And then within home, the default that it looks for is something called index. So if we leave it blank, that's where it goes to. It looks for that controller called home and the view called index, or the method within the controller that controls that view. So if I just type home, that is the name of a controller, and when you haven't put anything else in it, it's going to just go and look for the index and finds it. If, for example, I said home, let's put something else in, default, you'll notice that it can't find it because there isn't something we've specified called default. But we could be really strong about it and specify that we're going to the index, and there you see, you'll find the index. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. I think now is probably a good time to explain a little bit about how the controller operates the views. So the views are just like you'd normally see a HTML file. However, as I said before, it's a CS HTML file, which just means it's got C# code in it as well, which is basically this stuff here, but it can do a bit more than that. The controller tells it where to go. So if I open up the home controller here, just by left clicking on it, you'll see that it's got a few things in the home controller. It's got something called an iAction result called index, an iAction result called privacy, and an iAction result called error. These are what are called get routes. The main HTTP routes that you have are get and you have post. By default in MVC, they are get routes. You don't actually need to specify that they're get routes. You do need to specify the post routes. It can be good practice to make sure that they're written in there already as get and post, but it isn't really that necessary. So you can just put a HTTP get at the top of it. Like I said, this is kind of an automatic thing, but it can be good practice to actually start doing it when you're beginning with this, and then you really understand what's going on. There's a basic explanation. When a user logs in, they send a request to the server, and the server communicates to the controller, and the controller looks for the method that you've just asked for. So in this case, it looked for the home controller and it found the index route, and all it did is something here inside the method, which is return the view. And that's as simple as it is to tell a controller to find a view. That you have a controller of a name, in this case home controller, that's situated inside the controllers folder, and that by default looks for views within the corresponding views folder. So inside the views folder we've got home, and that's going to be looking for the view called index in the home folder of the views. You see also privacy is inside here as well. Error is not, and that's because you find that inside the shared controller here. I'm not going to go too much into this, but if you imagine that basically the error can be used for any page, and that's why we put it in the shared controller. Next time we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what views and controllers do, and we'll make a new view and how we can access it. So just to wrap up, we've learned the basic explanation of what MVC is, how to set up your first MVC project in Visual Studio. If you have any questions, then let me know. For those that know me, just Slack me or whatever. For those that don't, you can leave some questions in the comments and I'll try and reply to anybody. And please like, subscribe, share, all that usual stuff. I'll see you next time.